And so, but we really appreciate you here for Yamhill County to go ahead and stick with us and we can talk through this, yeah.
So again, the same situation here happened in Yamhill County with
Yeah. Oh, and if you are jumping off, also remember these slides, the video recording and the new numbers will be posted on our website next week. So be on the lookout for an email for that. Yeah.
For some people who just join us. So this is the population estimates for the Yamhill County based on the most recent cycle, which is a 23 cycle. And here we include revised population estimates for the previous year. This is for 22, 21, 20. And this is because, as I mentioned in my previous presentation, this is because we receive more data. So each year we go back to the previous year and revise them while we are producing the certified estimates for the current year. The population growth in Yamhill County is basically based on net migration. So here we can notice that there's a drop. It's not much, but there's a drop between 20 and 21. This is during the COVID time. This is because the net migration was negative, same as the natural change. But all in all, between the 2020 census and July 1st, 23, there is an increase in the population for the Yamhill County from 107K to 109K as of July 1st, 23. Handing over to Yamhill.
Yeah, okay. Thank you. Yeah, and so looking at the long-term trend, Yamhill is actually a county who in the long term is less impacted by some of the adjustments that we made for a couple of reasons. Mostly that we saw a bigger increase in 2020 than we had anticipated in terms for the population growth, right? Looking at components of change, this is a higher migration bounce back, in more recent years than what we had sort of expected. And that dropped a little bit with COVID, but nevertheless, we expect a bit more optimistic migration moving forward. We are expecting this impact of more deaths than births to become the norm moving forward. I know that who did mention it happened in 2020 and 2021, and 2021 to 2022 as well. Excuse me. But we expect that moving forward to be more commonplace. Births in terms of a total number looking to stabilize over time while deaths increase. And Yamhill is a little bit younger, so we haven't seen that big jump in the number of deaths that we've seen in other counties, but expect that to happen further down the line. And life expectancy in Yamhill is a bit better than the state average. Although fertility rates have been a little bit higher, and so we expect that to continue moving forward, but our fertility rates rather are expected to decline much similar that we saw for the rest of Oregon. In terms of age, you can see that even between 1990 and 2020, we went from having a very young population to a more even distribution, and for that to shift over time as Yamhill ages into the future by 2030 and then 2050. Population growth has been really large for Hispanic population, moving back from 1990 to 2020 within the county, growing by several fold, and disproportionately contributing to the population growth. Although both white and Asian Pacific Islander population growth have also contributed to these changes as well. It's going to do a brief one. I'm going to run through these relatively quickly, but if there's one that you want me to stop through, please ask me to do so, and I'll go ahead and do that. So just because we have quite a large number of UGBs within Yamhill, and we're a bit over time. So going through the Yamhill UGBs, Amity is the first one, UGB versus city boundaries. Population increased by about 8% between the 2010 and 2020 census. High persons per household with a household income that is about 90,000, and a non-white population about 20%. So modest population increase over time within the UGB big between 1990 and 2020, but then slowed down. So we expect population growth to continue at that modest rate over time before it more stabilizes in the late years by 2070. But 13% and 9% increases in the next 10 and 20 years forecast. Yeah. And you can see that growth rate is expected to be higher than average for the county before it more stabilizes over time, becomes lower than the average. Carlton, UGB versus city, population about 2,200, increasing by about 10% over the 10-year period. Age 65 plus about 14.19. Again, you see that reflected in the younger populations. Big population increases by 17, 32, and 10% for 1990, 2000, 2010 respectively. And a bit smaller comparable housing population growth during that time period. So we expect that moving forward. But again, you see those downward adjustments from the last time we made these forecasts. And Yamhill, nevertheless, expecting continued population growth in that area. Dayton, UGB versus city boundaries, so pretty big difference here in terms of like the population that we're accounting for in terms of the land area. Increased by about 5.68%, slower than the county and some of the other UGBs in the area. In a population that's 18.78%, that's 65 plus, that's more on par with the state average and older than Yamhill. So slower population growth a little bit, and you can see that reflected because of the older age population and the slower population growth. We have slower growth projected for Dayton than in other UGBs. And you can see that here in this graph as well. Growth in Dayton is expected to be lower than the region as well as the rest of the county. Dundee, population difference between the city and the UGB here, population of about 3,200 people. Again, very modest increase in the population since 2010, about 2.4% increase in the population. We saw big changes between 1990 and 2010, but way more modest growth happening in this location. And so you can see that a bit in our forecast, modest growth in the near term and long term as well, hovering around 5% per decade period. Gaston, here differences between the city and the UGB boundaries. Again, smaller population here of about 500 people. So it's a little bit harder to, say about the population dynamics when we have large growth and small and then declines in the population. But the general trajectory is hovering around 150 for a while. Before increasing longer over the time. Again, some of those dynamics where other places become more attractive as other places become more infilled. And you see that 400% growth, but for a small population, it's, not really expected to jump back to that. Lafayette, UGB versus city boundaries, population of about 4,400, 18% increase, in the population, so higher than the other UGBs that we were talking about here. And we have seen this population grow pretty sizably since 1990, jumping from 1.3 to 4.4. And so Lafayette is a location where we expect higher than the other UGBs that we're talking about in terms of population growth, jumping by about 13%. By 2030 up to 5,000, and then sustaining that 13% growth to 5,700. This is a forecast that is less impacted by the changes that we have made since the last time we say the forecast. You can see the differences between the 2020 forecast and this forecast here are much smaller. And you see the growth rate for Lafayette has historically been higher than the region or the county, and we expect that to be the same continue moving forward. McMinnville, UGB and city boundary here, population a bit larger than the other locations that we've been talking about, almost at 35,000. 65 plus population is a bit higher here, though, and the population growth has substantially slowed in the past 10 years. Still population growth at 7%, just more on par what we see in other places and not that explosive growth rate that we'd seen before. And so that's reflected here in the population growth that we see, 8% higher than what we saw in the 7%, so a little bit higher, but then we expect that to taper off as the population continues to move forward in the future and aging impacts it a bit more moving over time. Newburgh. And so please someone stop me here if you want to talk through Newburgh. For the Newburgh city and UGB populations, we have considerable overlap, but there is spaces within the UGB that aren't accounted for in the city boundaries, so it's important to distinguish. 13% increase, which is pretty good for a city of its size, in Newburgh and age 65 plus. That is a bit lower I will say that, part of this is, student population that's, bringing this down, the 65+ population, and we do account for that in our forecast in terms of the student population who lives there. So you're not getting the same sort of really large population growth necessarily that you'd expect for other cities that have that age profile. Nevertheless, still pretty large. And again, Newburgh outpaced expectations for population growth in the past 10 years. And so we expect some of that to carry forward as well in our forecast period. So again, a location that is not as impacted in some of the changes and adjustments we made. Here, the forecast is pretty on par with what we have made in 2020. You don't see those differences really hitting until we get to 2070. Again, higher than expected growth or higher than the other regions, other UGBs in the region and other UGBs in the counties growth. So Newburgh is an outlier here in terms of its population growth. Sheridan, so Sheridan is one where we received, and please stop me if you want to talk through Newburgh or through Sheridan as well. I know you received some comments about Sheridan as well. This is one where we've adjusted it quite a bit since November. We had population, decline. This is actually taken from census numbers, where the census estimated that Sheridan declined. We know that was due to misenumeration in the way that the city boundaries were accounted for in the population, and so we've adjusted for that. And so we know that the population is not 4.7 thousand in our forecast. It's closer to 6.3 thousand right now, and we expect Sheridan to continue to increase in its population size. So ignore that anomaly at the 2020, those are taken from the census numbers, and we know that's not an accurate reflection of the population. We did have population decline happening in the area that the last time we presented in November, but because we went through the survey responses and saw the number of housing unit productions that were made in this area, we did upwardly adjust it. Because our housing units were an underestimate there. So now you see population growth and less of a difference between the 2020 PSU/PRC forecast than what we had last time we made these projections in November. And again, a little bit hard to make out what the Sheridan growth looks like just because of that miscount in 2020. But nevertheless, we expect it to be higher, or on par with what we're seeing in the region and county, very similar there. Wilhelmina, city versus UGB boundaries there, smaller population, about 2,200 here, but growth about 10%. That was good population growth and higher than what we've seen on average in the past 30 years. So we expect that, to impact the population moving forward. We see big growth in the long term before it becomes more stable, and then eventually hitting a little bit of population decline as the population ages by 2070. Nevertheless, one of the locations that saw higher than what we had forecasted last time and a bigger population this time around. And lastly, Yamhill, Yamhill here, the city versus the UGB boundaries. We pretty much got complete overlap between these two. 12% population growth in Yamhill since the last census in 2010 and 2020 to 2020, but Yamhill has jumped a bit in population growth and population decline over the past 30 years. And the housing growth has been a little bit slower than the population growth during those periods. Two of these factors contributing to, we expect housing growth to ramp up a little bit in the near term, contributing to near-term population growth, but then it to stabilize over time. So we have near-term forecasts that are a bit higher than what we expected before, but long-term forecasts are a bit lower as we're not getting the same fertility benefit from that migration coming in. So more stable. So 20-year horizon that is very similar to what we had last time, but a 50-year horizon that's a little bit less tuned down than what we've seen before. And a great growth rate comparison here between the region and the county.